we tend to think of our presidents as standing at the head of the government, they are actually part of an elaborate balance of powers. Designed to guard against tyranny and corruption, it is a balance that has been able to shift with the course of history. The man who was chiefly responsible for the system was our fourth president, James Madison.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary. But in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, you must first enable the government to control the governed. And in the next place, oblige it to control itself.
He was the towering intellect of the Founding Fathers, possessing, as John Adams put it, a gigantic mind. He was also the smallest of all our presidents, standing just 5'4", weighing only 100 pounds.
James Madison was a rather slight figure, somewhat disheveled, thoughtful, with a sense of humor. He was very bright. He did not so much originate political ideas as he synthesized them. He's come down to us as a towering figure, but he was not a towering person. And that's an interesting contrast.
During the Revolutionary War, Madison had served in the Continental Congress, where he became convinced that America's government was deeply flawed. At the end of the war, he determined to help design a better system.
If some very strong props are not applied, the present system will tumble to the ground.
In the summer of 1786, Madison retreated to his family's Virginia estate called Montpelier. After making an exhaustive study of the world's governments, both past and present, he came to a striking conclusion. The chief flaw of both ancient and modern attempts at self-government was a lack of adequate central authority. Unless America could devise a stronger federal system, it would be doomed to failure. It was this message that Madison took to Philadelphia in 1787 to a national convention where 55 state delegates would decide the nation's future.
There never was an assembly of men charged with a great and arduous task who were more pure in their motives or more devoted to their object.
It was Madison who proposed a three-part government with separate legislative, judicial, and executive branches, with the legislature further divided into a House and Senate.
Thus, he created a Congress independent of the president, a president independent of Congress, both separated from the courts and, of course, separated from the states, which were the principal agencies of government in his day. Understanding that they would have to cooperate to get anything done, and that this required a certain comity among them.
The danger of undue power in the president is not to me formidable. I see and politically feel that will be the weak branch of the government. The legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people.
The chief opponents of a strong presidency were old guard Republicans who pushed for stronger states' rights. It was they who argued vehemently for a wide-ranging impeachment clause to be included in the Constitution. Madison insisted that the sole grounds for presidential impeachment should be treason and bribery. When his opponents added the words, "or other high crimes and misdemeanors," Madison argued that such a phrase was much too vague, but his objections were overruled. On September 17th, after 4 grueling months, the Constitution was signed by a majority of the delegates.
The Constitution was not the offspring of a single brain. It was the work of many heads and many hands. It is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as anything less than a miracle.
For his efforts in Philadelphia, James Madison would be named the father of the Constitution.
Madison may not precisely deserve the title Father of the Constitution, but he emphatically deserves the title of the, how shall I put it, the stitcher together, the tailor of the Constitution, if not its father. And without the coherence he gave of the ideas, we would have had a much rougher and less satisfactory document than we've had.
During Washington's presidency, Madison served in the newly created U.S. Congress. Then, after serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State, it finally was Madison's turn to assume the presidency.
We are teaching the world the great truth that governments do better without kings.
He succeeded Jefferson just after Jefferson had worn out his welcome, and Madison got the backlash. Madison had a terrible time in his first term as president. Whether anybody else could have done better is an open question. A war was forced upon him, but it was a terribly conducted war, not just by the president, but by the military. And it does nothing for Madison's reputation.
When Madison sent American troops into combat against British troops during the War of 1812, he faced fierce opposition from many in Congress who derided what they called Mr. Madison's War. With some states refusing to cooperate, it became a question of national leadership. Was the federal government strong enough to lead the nation in wartime?
To have shrunk from war would have acknowledged that the American people were not an independent people, but colonists and vassals.
Most Americans have forgotten that during the War of 1812, the White House was burned, the Capitol was burned, and the British withdrew, having taught the colonials a great lesson. The White House, indeed, is the White House because in repairing it afterwards, the government was too cheap to rebuild from the ground up. They saved the shell and painted it white to cover the scorch marks, which is why it's been white ever since.
Just 18 days after the destruction of Washington, an American victory at Baltimore Harbor renewed the nation's confidence and gave the country a new anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. By standing up to Great Britain and by simply not losing, America eventually won, in effect, a second war of independence.
If our first struggle was a war of our infancy, this last was that of our youth. It illustrates the capacity and the destiny of the United States to be a great, a flourishing, and a powerful nation.
In 1817, at the age of 65, Madison finished his term as president and returned with Dolly to his Virginia estate. The youngest of the founding fathers, he would outlast them all, living on for 20 more years.
I ought not to forget that I may be thought to have outlived myself.
All his life, he was an advocate of what he called balance, and his greatest legacy was a system of balanced government that would allow presidential power to adapt through the ages.
If one thing is clear, it is that executive power is shifting, changing, and variable over time. Well, I think that was understood very well. And unlike many state constitutions, the Madisonian Constitution was lean and spare and very difficult to amend. It has served us well because it has admitted of change.
I have always sought for the middle ground. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of distrust. So there are other qualities in human nature which justify esteem and confidence. American government brings out these qualities in a higher degree than any other form.
One of Madison's chief goals was to create a balance between geographical sections of the nation. But as new territories began to enter the Union, new pressures emerged. The president most responsible for maintaining balance during an era of expansion was an iron-willed politician from Tennessee, James K. Polk.
Polk was a loyal and hard-working Jacksonian. He'd been Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a staunch party man, a staunch Democrat, and absolutely devoted to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a nationalist, and he wanted to enlarge the country to the Pacific coast as fast as possible. That was really old Hickory's agenda. And Polk was a faithful son, if you will.
As America's push west intensified, the annexation of Texas became the hot political issue of the 1844 presidential campaign. Southern leaders in Congress supported it as a way to spread slavery to the new territory. And when presidential candidate Martin Van Buren, who was a Northerner, said he would hold off making any decision on the Texas issue, it turned many Democrats against him and opened the way for James K. Polk.
The Texas question is the all-absorbing one. I have no hesitation in declaring that I am in favor of immediate annexation.
On May 10, 1844, Polk was summoned to an emergency conference at the Tennessee estate of his 77-year-old mentor, Andrew Jackson.
After urgent solicitation, I came to this place yesterday. General Jackson speaks in terms of deep regret at the fatal error which Mr. Van Buren has committed. And he openly expresses what I assure you I never for a moment contemplated, that I would be the most available man.
Polk had no notion that he was going to be nominated for president. Polk was a strong annexationist. Jackson pushed Polk. In those days, it was not necessary to have been nominated in advance. Oh, you could be nominated on the spot on the convention floor, which is what happened to Polk.
Nicknamed Young Hickory, Polk won his party's nomination. And in the national election, where he ran largely on the issue of Texas, the 49-year-old candidate was victorious. At his inauguration, the Marine Band played Hail to the Chief for the first time. And as Polk was sworn into office, Samuel Morse tapped out the presidential oath using Morse code, making it the first live media event of its kind.
I am fully sensible that I came into the office not only at an earlier period of life than any of my predecessors, but perhaps with less of the public confidence in advance than any of them.
Right from the start, Polk sought to balance his cabinet, offering positions to many of his leading competitors. And he attempted to be rigorously fair in his executive appointments.
I intended to be respected as President of the United States. So I decided to adhere sternly to my principles without identifying myself with any faction or clique.
Outgoing President John Tyler, in the closing weeks of his administration, had formally approved the annexation of Texas. Polk's twin goals now were obtaining Oregon and the Pacific Northwest from Britain and acquiring the Mexican-owned Southwest all the way to California.
the Jacksonian Democrats were possessed of a strong conviction about what was called manifest destiny. They were determined to extend the country westward from the Rockies to the Pacific. This they felt to be God's will. They were executing. It's as serious as that. A manifest destiny meant precisely that. And there was almost religious fervor about it. The Mexicans weren't going to stand in the way. Now, that does not sit well with contemporary views of national or governmental morality at the end of the 20th century. But it sat very well with a majority of Americans in the middle of the 19th.
As Polk's presidency unfolded, his public stance for balance began to unravel as his natural preference for the Southwest took hold of him. Determined to use any means necessary to extend the nation's reach, Polk announced he was prepared to purchase the Southwest or, if necessary, take it from Mexico by force.
All agreed that if the Mexican forces committed any act of hostility, I should immediately send a message to Congress recommending a declaration of war.
When after a full year Mexican aggression failed to materialize, President Polk would wait no longer. On Saturday, May 9, 1846, he informed his cabinet he would commence hostilities himself.
I said that it was impossible I could remain silent much longer. I told them that I thought I ought to make a message of war to Congress by Tuesday next. All except the Secretary of the Navy agreed.
That same evening, word arrived that the Mexican army had attacked U.S. soldiers. Polk now had the justification he wanted for war.
The commanding general of the Mexican forces crossed the river, invaded our territory, and shed the blood of our citizens on our own soil. Congress promptly responded and granted me the means for a vigorous prosecution of war.
For a year and a half, Polk's armies bludgeoned Mexico into submission. The only war president since James Madison, Polk became consumed by the struggle, saying he would stand and fight until the last man fell in the conflict. Taking on the work of many of his cabinet members, he became the first president to remain all summer in the White House, refusing to take more than a few days of vacation. By September 1847, the war was effectively over, and the United States would soon be expanded by 1.2 million square miles.
The war with Mexico was forced upon us, but it was clear that we would, if practicable, obtain California and other portions of the Mexican territory to indemnify our claimants and to defray the expenses of the war.
Opponents in Congress stressed that these lands had been acquired by an immoral war and would lead to a crisis involving the question of slavery within them. But Polk had won the Southwest through conquest and treaty, and by direct payment to Mexico of $15 million. And to the end of his life, he considered it his greatest achievement.
The acquisition of California and New Mexico are results of greater consequence than any since the adoption of the Constitution.
He got a lot done. Harry Truman, who identified with him a good deal, used to say, Polk is a great man. He promised to do a lot, and he did it all. And that really is true. Those cessions of territory and their immediate consequences brought into the center of national politics the issues that would dominate for the next decade and end in civil war.
By his final year in office, the president was exhausted. With the volatile issue of slavery in the new territories heating up, all Polk wanted was to turn the office over to another. He had pledged that he would serve only one term, but even if he had wished to, he could not have run again. By incessant work, by an unwillingness to delegate, and by his refusal to rest, he had destroyed his health.
They have been 4 years of incessant labor and anxiety. I am rejoiced that my political career is now closed. Henceforth, I shall be a private citizen.
But though Polk dreamed of a happy retirement in Tennessee with his wife Sarah, it was not to be. On his return journey home, he became seriously ill, and just 3 months after leaving office, the 11th president lay dying.
I have been highly honored by my fellow men and have filled the highest station on earth. I will soon go the way of all the earth. I pray God to prepare me to meet the great event.
Except during Abraham Lincoln's presidency, after Polk, the balance of power shifted decisively back to Congress and remained there for the rest of the 19th century. But in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt claimed new powers to accomplish what he called the people's business. And the man whom Roosevelt chose to carry on his work in the White House was a soft-spoken intellectual named William Howard Taft.
The administration of President Roosevelt, like a great crusade, awakened the people of the United States and accomplished great advances in the powers of the federal government. But I am determined to paddle my own canoe. I am hopeful that a consistent, steady, quiet course will ultimately convince people that I am worthy of their respect.
The first thing everyone remembered about William Howard Taft was his size. He was enormous. He weighed something like 300 pounds. He was a thoroughly nice man, as well as a big man, and a man with a sense of humor. Taft has to be respected as a legal scholar, yet he was not a politician. And why Theodore Roosevelt thought that Taft should succeed him is an open and puzzling question.
William Howard Taft grew up in a well-to-do Cincinnati family, where instilled in him from an early age was an ambition to one day sit on the Supreme Court. After excelling at Yale and then at the Cincinnati Law School, Will Taft began to practice law and to climb the Republican ladder.
Like every well-trained Ohio man, I always had my plate the right side up when officers were falling.
During the Harrison administration, he served as Solicitor General, and at 34, he was appointed a federal circuit judge. It was a job that the slow-moving, scholarly Taft could have been content with for the rest of his life. But if what Taft wanted most was fretless serenity, he had chosen the wrong wife. And when he was asked to head up a new commission in the Philippines, Helen Taft saw it as a stepping stone to power and urged him to take it.
She is quite disposed to sit as Pope and direct me.
In the Philippines, Taft made an international name for himself before being summoned back to Washington to serve as Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War. Roosevelt liked Taft's happy face, his guttural laugh, his absolute honesty, and the vigorous way he acted as his worldwide troubleshooter.
The president seems really to take much comfort that I am in his cabinet. He tells me so, and he tells people who tell me. He is a very sweet-natured man and a very trusting man when he believes in one.
Hail to our leader for 1908.
When Roosevelt decided not to run for a third term, In 1908, he pushed Taft for the nomination. Winning the election in November by a landslide, Taft could hardly believe he had been catapulted into the White House. It was only the second elective office he had ever held.
If I were now presiding in the Supreme Court, I should feel entirely at home. But here I feel just a bit like a fish out of water. I pinch myself every little while to make myself realize that it is all true.
As president, Taft promoted conservation, created the postal savings system, and exercised more trust-busting than had Roosevelt. He worked to help create a Department of Labor and established the first ever executive budget. And he completed what his predecessor had begun in Latin America, presiding over the construction of the Panama Canal. But Taft was also prone to mistakes. He alienated potential allies for no good reason, fought for small victories, and had none of Roosevelt's magical way with the press or his extraordinary energy.
I am sorry, but I cannot be more aggressive than my nature made me. Mr. Roosevelt's heart was generally on his sleeve, and he must communicate his feelings. I find myself unable to do so.
He didn't have a talent for dramatizing himself and his issues in the process. He was not interested in exploring, perhaps because he had little talent for exploring, all those mechanisms of widening the presidential office that Theodore Roosevelt had gone in for. And he certainly was not interested in pursuing an adventurous foreign policy of Teddy Roosevelt's type.
16 months after leaving office, following a widely publicized African hunting tour, Theodore Roosevelt returned to America to find the Republican Party divided and Taft seemingly adrift. The old fighter was horrified and began saying so to fellow Republicans.
His whole attitude to me since his return has been unfriendly. I hate to be at odds with Theodore Roosevelt, who made me president, but of course I have to be president.
As Roosevelt became more and more vocal in his criticism of Taft, the bewildered president could not bring himself to retaliate.
I am deeply hurt. Roosevelt was my closest friend. It is hard, very hard, to see a devoted friendship going to pieces.
Though Roosevelt claimed to support Taft for the next election, he was already secretly planning to run himself, and Taft knew it.
The fact is, if you were to remove his skull now, you would find written on his brain, 1912.
Roosevelt's ambitions cast a pall over the second half of Taft's presidency, as did the disastrous midterm elections which went decisively to the Democrats. As the pressures mounted, Taft reacted by overeating, eventually growing from 300 to 355 pounds. To escape the anxiety, he played endless rounds of golf, took long trips across the country, and grew crankier by the day. Finally, he decided to fight back.
I don't want to fight, but when I do fight, I want to fight hard.
After the Republican convention in June, when Taft won the nomination, Roosevelt abandoned the Republicans and became the candidate of the new Progressive Party. Taft, who now saw Roosevelt as out of control and seeking too much power, finally spoke his mind.
He is to be classed with the leaders of religious cults. I look upon him as I look upon a freak almost. I have got to win, not for myself, but to prevent the triumph of a dangerous demagogue.
But in striking contrast to the excitement generated by Roosevelt, and also by the Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson, the dramaless, increasingly conservative Taft seemed to be courting defeat.
The people have a yearning for something startling and radical that I am not likely to furnish them. I have been told that I ought to do this, ought to do that I do not keep myself in the headlines. I know it, but I can't do it. I couldn't if I would, and I wouldn't if I could.
Poor President Taft was out of his element. He was a great administrator. He was also a great judge. He was a terrible politician. He wasn't a politician at all. He was an unhappy president. He probably should never have been president at all.
In many ways, it was a great relief for Taft when Woodrow Wilson, not Roosevelt, won the election in November. Taft himself finished a distant third. In a post-election appearance, he posed a question: what are we to do with our ex-presidents? Then answered it himself.
The proper and scientific administration of a dose of chloroform might make a fitting end, and at the same time would secure the country from the troublesome fear that the occupant could ever come back.
Such a solution would have robbed Taft of the most fulfilling quarter of his life. First as a professor of law at Yale University, then as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only time in our history that a president has held that other highest office. Finally content, and in the job he had always wanted, Taft lost 100 pounds, and his good nature returned. His troubled presidency no longer mattered to him.
Perhaps it is the comfort and dignity and power without worry I like. I don't remember that I ever was president.
All along, what William Howard Taft believed in more than anything else was an even-handed government. He possessed an appreciation for all the branches that was unusual for a president. By constraining his own power and articulating why, he became the last great example of a president concerned with balance.
The true view of the executive function is, as I conceive it, that the president can exercise no power which cannot be fairly and reasonably traced to some specific grant of power. Such specific grant must be either in the Constitution or in an act of Congress. There is no undefined residuum of power which he can exercise because it seems to him to be in the public interest.
After Taft, the balance of power shifted again under the force of Franklin Roosevelt, leading to an era when the executive branch dominated like it never had before. It wasn't until after Watergate that Congress seized back its powers and restored an earlier sense of balance. But by the 1990s, that balance had been upset once again, this time by an intense new level of partisanship. No president in modern times was more impacted by political divisiveness than was the 42nd president, Bill Clinton.
Our system of government, those separated institutions sharing and competing for powers, are, if anything, too separated today. By the time of Bill Clinton, the glue that had held Congress together in a tight hierarchical relationship had been dissolved. Only once has polarization got so great. Only once have our national parties fractured. When they did, we had a civil war. We're not at such a point. But you have dangerous potentials in the country. Truly dangerous.
The presidency can still be a place of great influence and power. It's still the central office in the country, particularly in times of adversity or crisis. But it can be in good times as well, but it requires a greater level of energy. There's not an automatic deference to the presidency. But I still think it's the greatest job in the world, and I still think it's very, very important to the American people.
William Jefferson Clinton was born in 1946 as William Blythe III in the small town of Hope, Arkansas. By grade school, he was so outgoing, he was already recognized as a young man with a future in politics.
I think what shaped my early interest in politics were a couple of things. First of all, I was always interested in civil rights. And it was the defining political issue of my childhood. And I think the other thing that really had a lot to do with it was the fact that we got a television when I was 9 years old.
I see.
And I got to watch, in 1956, the Republican and Democratic conventions on television. I watched the whole thing.
Bill Clinton was the son of a salesman who died before he was born, and a nurse, Virginia Dell, who was his greatest influence.
She taught me never give up, never forget where you came from, and never lose your compassion for people who are less fortunate than you are.
From early on, he always attracted attention. He was musical, immensely popular, easygoing, and ambitious. In 1963, at age 17, he went to experience Washington, D.C. firsthand. There, he got to shake hands with his political hero, John F. Kennedy. The encounter changed Bill Clinton's life forever.
Thankfully, we were lined up in alphabetical order by state, so I was from Arkansas. And I also was bigger than most of the people around me, so I sort of elbowed my way up to make sure if he didn't shake hands with everyone, I'd get to shake hands with him. When I went home, I had the feeling that if I worked hard and prepared myself, that I could have an impact. And that was a gift I got out of that week.
The following year, Clinton entered Georgetown University, where he became known for his self-confidence, his intelligence, and as a man in a hurry. After spending 2 years at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, he attended Yale Law School. There he met Hillary Rodham, an active idealist whose no-nonsense ways were the perfect complement to his freewheeling charm. Accepting a position on the faculty of the University of Arkansas Law School in 1972, Clinton used it as a springboard into Arkansas politics.
I ran for Congress in 1974 and was defeated, and then in 76 I was Attorney General, and I loved that job. But their vacancy occurred in the governor's race, and I went and I won, and it was exhilarating. I loved it.
Now, you were governor at age 32. That's awfully young.
Very young, maybe too young.
As governor, Bill Clinton bristled with ideas and energy. But he also made a series of political miscalculations, causing him to lose his bid for re-election.
The people of my state had the opinion that I was a smart person who cared about them, but I was too bullheaded, and I didn't listen to them enough. They told me what I'd done wrong. They then gave me a second chance to serve, and I think the service was, I know it was good for me and my family. I believe it was good for my state.
Just 10 years later, at age 46, Bill Clinton was running for president.
Good to see you.
Early in his campaign, his candidacy was threatened by rumors regarding infidelity in his personal life. With the strong support of his wife, Hillary, Bill Clinton became the first presidential candidate ever to publicly admit to marital problems. But it was behind them now, he said, and entirely a private matter. The candidate insisted that he be judged not on his private life, but by his performance and his political record. His words made sense to a public that seemed to be growing more tolerant. And from a position low in the polls, Bill Clinton soared to second place in the New Hampshire primary, earning the nickname the Comeback Kid.
He's a man who loves people, loves to talk, loves to circulate, is thus a natural politician. And the naturalness of his political qualities extends to a very sharp instinct for campaigning, for feeling the moods of his audience and responding to them. And it has served him well.
By sticking to the issues and promising the kind of change that only a young man of a new generation could bring about, Clinton won a resounding victory in a three-way presidential race in November.
I felt profound gratitude to the American people, but there was a little bit of me that felt like the dog that was chasing the pickup, and finally caught it and said, now what do? But I was also humbled by it. I think, any person who's not a little humbled by being given this responsibility doesn't understand what he or she has got a hold of. And I think that when a person gets this office, you feel always never quite adequate to do the work. No one is smart enough, or wise enough, or strong enough.
Determined to make his mark as a democratic reformer, he set in motion an ambitious agenda to reshape numerous social programs, including a bold initiative to create universal health care coverage. Republicans criticized it as an overambitious liberal experiment, and health care became the rallying cry for a strong political opposition. It led to sweeping congressional victories in 1994, with the Republicans gaining control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years.
There's always been periods of more intense partisanship, followed by periods of lesser intensity. And it was something I'm not used to, didn't cultivate, don't believe in, and would like to see diminished.
Partisanship in the government reached epidemic proportions by the end of Bill Clinton's first term. Twice in 1995, the government was forced to shut down, with Clinton and the Republican-controlled Congress at loggerheads over the budget. The spirit of compromise, key to the workings of the Madisonian system of government, was degenerating into a system of mutual antagonisms. Shortly after Bill Clinton was soundly re-elected to a second term, the Madisonian system was put to a further test. When the Supreme Court ruled in the civil case of Jones versus Clinton that a sitting president could be sued for actions taken prior to his term, Clinton was forced to testify in a sexual harassment lawsuit against him. It was in this politically charged atmosphere that an independent counsel, with virtually unlimited investigative powers, intensified his scrutiny. The presidency was now under siege on all fronts.
Mr. Starr, do you swear that the testimony...
Failing to uncover incriminating evidence in what became known as Whitewater, Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr shifted his focus from Clinton's business dealings to his personal life. And in 1998, he exposed an affair between the president and a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky, claiming that Clinton had perjured himself when he denied it under oath in the Paula Jones civil case. On December 19th, the House of Representatives voted to impeach. The official charges were perjury and obstruction of justice, but throughout the trial, the underlying dynamic was political. 1998 was a difficult year for you, Mr. President, both professionally and personally. During the impeachment process, the issue of character was raised, a hard one to define by anybody's measure. But from your own experience, how important is that issue of character for a president?
I think it's very important. But I think a lot of the people who talk about it do so in ways that give it a very limited definition, normally for purposes that are quite self-serving. That is, most of the people I've known who demonstrated great character didn't go around talking about it. Now, I made a personal mistake which became a matter of public debate. I tried to acknowledge my wrongdoing and say that I was sorry about it. But I also have tried to demonstrate presidential character by standing up for the interests of the country and doing what I told the American people I would do when I ran for office. But I think it's important for us to remember that there is also a difference between character and reputation, and that under the guise of elevating character, there are a large number of people in our country today that believe the way they can get what they want in life is by destroying someone else's reputation. None of us is ever a complete judge of another's character. Only God can fully judge that.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons
Throughout
are
the Senate trial, there loomed a major constitutional issue of exactly what constituted an impeachable offense, and whether the president's misleading testimony in the Jones case and before the Starr grand jury rose to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. If an elected president could be removed, scholars warned, on the basis of his personal relationships and an effort to cover them up, the Madisonian system itself could be in danger of collapse.
While some people hated Clinton to an extraordinary degree, a hatred which says more about the country and its times than it does about him. Many others have had a fondness for him that owes nothing to ignorance about defects in his private life. He's had the good fortune to have a personality which encourages discrimination between himself as president and himself as a private individual. And his personality has conquered all kinds of doubts about him.
Despite impassioned calls for his resignation, throughout the trial, Clinton's approval ratings remained extremely high. And in the end, the Senate listened to the people.
The Senate, having tried William Jefferson Clinton...
As a body, it could not muster the required two-thirds vote, or even a simple majority, to convict Bill Clinton of any charges.
Said William Jefferson Clinton be, and he hereby is, acquitted of the charges.
The American people spoke out loud and clear throughout 1998. You know that better than anybody.
They were very good to me.
Well, what did you learn about the power of the people and the role the public plays in exercising political power from here?
I learned all over again the same lesson I learned as a child, that there are certain rules of human conduct that apply to all of us, and when you make a mistake, you have to live with the consequences of your actions, whether they're public or not. We always pay. Nobody gets out for free. The second thing I learned is the framers were smart. They designed the Constitution to prevent partisan passions from overriding common sense. But the third thing was that the American people almost always get it right. They gave me a second chance. And I think if we think about life as getting second chances, as long as you learn from your mistakes, I think it's a helpful way to look at life. And so I do believe in a God of second chances.
How's the presidency changed you?
You know, I've had to ask for forgiveness in a way that most people never do in public, although nearly everybody does in private at some point during a lifetime. I've learned a lot about giving up the little things in life so you can focus on the big things. If I had only felt I was doing it for myself, I'm not sure I would have had the strength, but knowing that I was doing it for the American people helped me, and I'm very grateful for that, because I think it's something I can carry with me for the rest of my life.
The only Democrat to be re-elected president since FDR, Bill Clinton both reflected and benefited from an increasingly tolerant America. And while most Americans deplored his personal acts in the Lewinsky case, they refused to judge his public role by his private behavior.
From Nixon's time on, though we weren't very conscious of it to begin with, it is now plain that every president immediately upon election attracts the serious intent of political opponents and the professional interest of the media in tearing him down and pushing him toward resignation. It used to be that one of the most fundamental powers underlying a president's position was a fixed term. We now see that the Nixon precedent has unfixed the term and has created, both for media and for politicians, incentives to try to shorten the term. Well, I find that sad in a way that goes far beyond Bill Clinton. It affects all successive presidents, as far ahead as we can see.
The presidency, now well into its third century, is in many ways not the same institution it once was. Our early presidents worked virtually alone, with a single secretary or two, paid out of their own pocket. Today, the White House staff numbers more than 500. Altogether, the executive branch consists of nearly 2 million civilians. From humble beginnings, an almost baffling complexity has arisen. And yet through it all, there remains a single person at the center who must shoulder the office. However he, someday she, has arrived at the White House, whether through heroism or compromise, through family ties or through happenstance, through political savvy or passionate vision, or lonely integrity, each inherits and builds upon the work of his predecessors, bringing to bear talents and also human flaws, and sometimes a rare capacity to rise to greatness. These individuals together embody the American president.